The air was thick with a quiet that always seemed to deepen at night. When I was little, I would press my ear against the pillow, and the muffled sound of my heartbeat would echo in my ears, like the soft, steady footsteps of someone creeping across a carpeted floor. It was never loud, never frantic, but always there, slow, deliberate, and insistent. And every night, just as I was on the verge of slipping into sleep, I would hear those footsteps. They'd pull me back from the edge of dreams, cold terror seizing my chest. My heart would race, but the footsteps, they never stopped. They were there, lurking in the dark. I lived with my mother in a house that was both new and old, the kind of place you could see being moved into pieces down the highway. It was a modest home, surrounded by thick woods that I would explore during the day. But when night fell, those woods became something else, something far darker, full of shadows and things that whispered just beyond sight. And beneath the house, there was a crawlspace, a place that fed my imagination, filling my mind with things that should never be thought about. Monsters, claws scraping against the floor, unseen eyes watching from the dark corners. But the footsteps, they were real. I told my mom about them, but she always brushed it off, saying I was just imagining things. I tried to explain, but her solution was always the same: a cold blast of water from a turkey baster to clear my head. It never worked. Of course, the footsteps would always return. Sometimes, I would wake up on the bottom bunk, even though I had gone to sleep on the top. It wasn't a huge deal. I'd sometimes get up for a drink or to use the bathroom, and I'd just end up in the wrong bed. But it happened often enough to feel strange. One night, though, it was different. I woke up cold, so cold. I opened my eyes, and the first thing I saw was the sky. Stars. I wasn't in my room anymore. I was in the woods. Panic hit me like a wave. I didn't understand what was happening. I thought I was dreaming, but nothing felt right. The ground beneath me was unfamiliar, the woods too dark and twisted. In front of me, a deflated pool float shaped like a shark lay discarded in the dirt. It was surreal, like I was trapped in some nightmare I couldn't escape from. I stood up, my feet aching, and tried to figure out where I was. I'd explored these woods 100 times, but this place this wasn't the same. I stepped forward, pain shooting through my foot as I stepped on something sharp. Thorn bushes everywhere. I looked at my other foot, fine. No cuts, no scratches, nothing. But the pain was real, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I walked, and walked, and walked. The woods seemed to stretch on forever, and the only sound that broke the silence was the distant cry of something. Or someone. A baby, a cat. I didn't know, but it terrified me. I ran, veering through the underbrush, stumbling over roots, too afraid to stop. My feet were bleeding, but I didn't care. I had to get out. Then, I saw the pool float. It was right there, not far from where I had woken up. I had been walking in circles. The woods were playing tricks on me, trapping me in some twisted game. I couldn't tell where I'd come from or where I was going. It was as if the forest itself had conspired to keep me there. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the ditch, a familiar landmark. I was close. I was so close to home. My heart leapt as I saw the roof of my house in the distance. I ran faster, desperate to get back, but as I rounded the corner, I froze. Every light in the house was on. My mom was awake. I wasn't sure how to explain what had happened, but I knew I had to get inside. I reached for the doorknob, but before I could open it, two arms wrapped around me, pulling me back. I screamed, terrified, calling for my mom, but the arms held me tight. And then, through the dim light, I saw a figure step out onto the porch. A man, huge and looming, blocking the doorway. My heart pounded as I struggled against his grip, demanding to know where my mom was, what he had done to her. But then, I heard it, a voice, my mom's voice. "Honey, please calm down, I've got you." I turned, and there she was, standing behind me, holding me close. The relief that flooded me was overwhelming. Everything was okay. But then, my mom said something that made my blood run cold. "We found your note." A note. I didn't remember writing any note. But there it was, on the table. The police officer slid it toward me. It was a letter, written in my handwriting, saying that I was unhappy and never wanted to see my mom again. But the worst part, the note didn't even spell my name right. I didn't write that letter, and then the memories flooded back, the balloons, the pictures, the strange, blurry photographs that had been sent to me over the course of the year. The ones I had forgotten about, tucked away in a drawer. My mom had never seen them, and I had never shown them to anyone. But now, I wondered if those pictures had been a warning all along. The footsteps, the woods, the note ... They were all part of something darker than I could have ever imagined. Something had been watching me. Something had been waiting. The day had started innocently enough, with Josh and I wandering through the neighborhood, checking out abandoned houses, each more desolate than the last. We didn't find anything of interest, but by the time we reached the 10th, Josh had grown bored and suggested we go play in the ditch down the street. The air was thick with a kind of unsettling stillness, but we ignored it, too caught up in our dirt war to notice anything off. That was until the rustling started. At first, we thought it was just the usual noise from the woods: raccoons, stray cats, maybe a fox. But this sound was different, too loud, too deliberate. It was almost mechanical, like something was moving through the underbrush with purpose. We both froze, eyes darting toward the trees. I made a guess, trying to break the tension. "It's a mummy." Josh laughed, but the wrestling didn't stop. It only grew louder, closer. Josh's face turned serious, his eyes locking onto mine. "You heard that, right?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It sounded like a robot, didn't it? I nodded, my heart pounding. The sound was unmistakable now, a low hum, like gears grinding against each other, an unnatural rhythm. We both stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do, until Josh's mom arrived to pick him up. He left, but the strange sound stayed with me, echoing in my mind long after he was gone. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of something watching me, something wrong. I crept out of bed, drawn to the Polaroids I had collected earlier that day. The photographs had always been strange, but now, under the weight of the day's events, they seemed different. I spread them out on the floor, one by one, and began to arrange them into a grid. The more I looked, the clearer the images became: a tree, a sign, a group of people entering a building. But then, I saw it. My stomach twisted. There, in the back of the crowd, barely visible, was me. Holding my mother's hand, I was in the picture. But how? I wasn't supposed to be there. I felt a wave of dizziness, as if the world around me was tilting, as if something was terribly wrong. The photos blurred together, and I realized with growing horror that I was in every single one. Always in the background, always just a shadow at the edge of the frame. My face barely visible, but undeniably there. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to hide, to forget, but I couldn't. The sense of dread gnawed at me, growing stronger with every photo I looked at. I couldn't even bring myself to show my mom. The unease was overwhelming, and I decided to wait until morning. When the sun rose, I tried to tell my mom. I showed her the photos, trying to explain what I had seen, but her reaction was not what I expected. She went pale, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at the pictures, and then, without warning, she grabbed the phone and dialed the police. I was confused, terrified. What was going on? Why was she so scared? The answer came when I pulled another Polaroid from the envelope one hadn't seen before. It was me and Josh, standing in the woods, just like we had the day before. But this time, the photo was close, too close. We were smiling, but something about the image felt wrong. I screamed for my mom, but she was already on the phone, pacing back and forth. Her words were frantic, and she barely seemed to notice me. She kept repeating that there was no postmark on the envelope. The photos weren't just strange, they were impossible. I didn't understand, but I would soon. Years later, I would revisit that day, the strange photos, the whispering rustle in the woods, the feeling of something watching me from the shadows. It all came rushing back when I realized how connected everything truly was. How the past, the things I thought I had left behind, were still very much alive. And as I stood in Josh's room that night, flashlight in hand, walking through the woods to my old home, I knew that the things I had left behind weren't gone at all. They were waiting for me, just as they had always been, and I was never truly alone. As I trudged through the woods, I stumbled, my foot catching on something unseen, and I nearly fell into a large, dark hole that had appeared in the center of the clearing. I regained my balance just in time, my heart pounding as I stood at its edge, staring down into its depths. It was deeper than I expected, and I couldn't shake the unsettling thought that it hadn't been there before. My mind raced, trying to recall the night I had awoken here, but I couldn't place it. I quickly pushed it from my mind and turned to Josh, frustration creeping in. "Quit messing around, man. You saw I was stuck over there. You were just lying here, joking around in that float." I kicked the exposed part of the float, the screeching noise that followed sending a chill down my spine. Josh's smile vanished, his face contorting with sudden terror. He struggled to free himself from the float, his movements awkward, but each time he fell back, the screeching grew louder, more frantic. I wanted to help, but my legs wouldn't move, frozen in place. I hated these woods. I grabbed the flashlight that had fallen from Josh's thrashing and shined it on the float, expecting something, though I wasn't sure what. The light revealed nothing but the eerie stillness. Then, suddenly, Josh managed to get off, and I heard him rush toward me, his eyes wide with panic. "It's a rat," I muttered nervously, watching the creature dart into the woods, taking the screeches with it. Josh punched me lightly in the arm, his smile returning, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. We picked up our pace, eager to leave the woods behind, but as we approached the bend that led to my old neighborhood, a sense of dread settled over me. The house I had once known so well was now dark and abandoned, its once pristine exterior now decaying. The lawn was overgrown, and a shutter hung loosely, creaking in the wind. I could feel the weight of the memories pressing down on me. I was struck by a horrifying realization: there were no new owners. The house was empty, forsaken. Why had my mother lied to me about it? But I pushed the thought aside, relieved that we could look around without worrying about being caught. It would make things quicker. Josh, ever the cynic, commented on the state of the house. "Your old house sucks, dude," he muttered, though his voice was laced with a hint of unease. I barely heard him, my mind racing. The house was abandoned, but something didn't feel right. I suggested we look for boxes under the house, but Josh wasn't keen on the idea. "There's no way I'm going under there," he protested. I dared him, and after a tense game of rock, paper, scissors, I lost. Reluctantly, I crawled under the house, flashlight and walkie-talkie in hand. The smell hit me first, a suffocating stench of decay. I gagged and tried to call out to Josh, but the walkie-talkie crackled with static. "Josh, are you there?" I asked, my voice shaky. "It smells like something died down here." The smell only intensified as I crawled deeper into the crawl space, my heart pounding. I shone the flashlight around, but the beam barely cut through the thick darkness. Then, I felt it something cold and unnatural. My hand recoiled in horror, and I slowly turned the flashlight to reveal what lay just beyond the support block. The creature was hideous, twisted, decaying, its teeth unnaturally large. I recoiled in disgust, my breath catching in my throat. "It's a raccoon," I muttered, though I knew deep down that it wasn't. My mind screamed that something was terribly wrong, but I tried to push the thought away. I radioed Josh, telling him to be careful, but the weight of the situation hung heavy on my chest. Josh's voice crackled through the walkie-talkie. low and panicked. There's something wrong here. Something's not right. I tried to ignore the dread that was settling over me, but then I heard the footsteps above me. Heavy, dragging footsteps. Then, a loud thud. "Josh." I whispered, panic rising in my chest. He wasn't answering. The only sound that followed was the dreadful noise of footsteps, dragging closer. Suddenly, I saw them dozens of dead animals, their bodies scattered around the crawl space. Among them, I recognized the shape of a cat. Boxes. I felt my heart drop. Had he come back here? Was this his fate? My mother's warnings echoed in my mind, and I realized she had known all along. She had known about the creature that had made its home under our house, and she had kept it from me. As I struggled to free myself from the crawl space, I heard Josh's voice again, but it was faint, almost as if it were coming from far away. Then, a terrifying realization hit me. What if Josh had told them I was under here? What if they were coming for me next? I scrambled desperately, but the board was wedged tight. I couldn't move it. My breath came in ragged gasps as the footsteps above me grew louder. Then, with a sudden force, the board was thrown aside. I gasped in terror, but it wasn't the creature. It was Josh, pulling me from the crawl space. We ran, not looking back, but I could still hear the sounds behind us yelling, dragging footsteps, and a scream that wasn't full of fear. We made it to the fence, jumping over it, but Josh's walkie-talkie fell. He reached for it, but I told him to leave it. We had to go. As we ran through the woods, Josh kept muttering, "My picture." He took my picture, his voice breaking. When we finally made it to Josh's house, I was exhausted, my mind still reeling. I asked him about the strange bag he had seen, but he wasn't sure if it had moved. We sat in his room, staring out the window, waiting for whatever was coming next. It wasn't until later, when I returned home, that the full horror of the night hit me. Around 3 a.m., I finally fell asleep, only to be awoken by the sound of boxes meowing. My heart leapt, thinking he had finally come home. I rushed to find him, but as I looked under the bed, I found only the muffled sound of his cries coming from my walkie-talkie. Boxes never came home. The story took a darker turn when I think back on it now. Mrs. Maggie, with her loose white curls and floral dresses, always called out to Josh and me from her back porch while we swam in the lake. She seemed sweet, always inviting us in for snacks, claiming she was lonely because her husband, Tom, was always away on business. But there was something unsettling about her, something off that made us hesitate every time. She'd call after us, "Chris and John, you're welcome here anytime," her voice trailing behind us as we walked back to my house, and I remember feeling like we were being watched. Her yard, with its strange sprinklers that would turn on at odd hours, was another mystery. The rest of the neighborhood was dry and barren during the winter, but Mrs. Maggie's yard always looked like an eerie winter wonderland, frozen in time. Ice hung from every branch and leaf, sparkling in the sunlight with an unnatural glow. Josh and I would walk on the ice, play with the icicles, as if it were some kind of magical place. But it was always too perfect, too still, like it was waiting for something to happen. I remember asking my mom why Mrs. Maggie left her yard like that. My mom, in a voice thick with sorrow, explained that Mrs. Maggie was sick, confused. She couldn't remember things, even the name of her own husband. Tom, she said, had been dead for years, but Mrs. Maggie didn't know. She still thought he was away, still waited for him to come home. It made me feel sorry for her, but even then, something felt wrong. As the years passed, I learned more about Mrs. Maggie's past. She had 2 sons, Chris and John, but they never visited her. Maybe they had their reasons, or maybe it was the illness that kept them away. It didn't matter. I think sometimes, when she looked at Josh and me, she saw them as children again, or maybe she saw what she wished for. The loneliness must have been suffocating. Then, one summer, Josh and I set out to explore the woods near my house. We had dreams of mapping the land, charting the paths of the lake and the creek that connected our two homes. But as we ventured deeper, the woods grew darker, thicker, and more unnerving. It was a place where even the trees seemed to whisper. One day, we built a raft from scraps of construction material, and as we pushed off into the water, Mrs. Maggie waved at us from her porch, calling us back. But we didn't listen. We paddled further, past the familiar paths, into the unknown. The woods were silent, save for the occasional rustling that made us look over our shoulders. We laughed it off at first, calling out hello into the woods, mocking whatever might be watching us. But then, a voice answered. It wasn't the voice of an animal, or anything natural. It was a whisper, a breathless, strained hello, coming from the darkness just beyond the map. We froze, the laughter dying in our throats. Something was out there, something that shouldn't have been. I fired off a Roman candle into the night, thinking it would reveal the truth. But there was nothing. The woods remained silent, too silent. As we tried to paddle back, our raft broke apart. The water was cold, and the forest around us seemed to close in. We were trapped, too cold to move, too scared to look back. And then, in the distance, I saw something floating in the water, the map, drifting away. I turned to Josh, asking where my shirt was, but he didn't know. I ran back along the shoreline, desperate to find it, desperate to leave the eerie, suffocating woods behind. But then, just as I was about to give up, I heard it. A sound, coming from just behind me, a whisper. A voice that wasn't mine, or Josh's, or anyone I knew. And in that moment, I realized that Mrs. Maggie's loneliness had become something darker, something that reached out from the shadows, pulling me into a world where the past never truly left, and the dead never really went away. I spun around, heart racing, and there she was, Mrs. McGee. I'd never seen her at night before, and in the dim light, she looked fragile, almost unnatural. The warmth that always seemed to surround her had vanished, replaced by an unsettling chill. I couldn't remember a time when I had seen her without a smile, but tonight her face was a strange, hollow mask. "Hello, Mrs. McGee," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, hi, Chris," she replied, her voice too cheerful for the moment. The warmth returned to her, but something about it felt off, like a flickering candle. I couldn't see it was you in the dark. I half-jokingly asked if she was going to invite me in for a snack, but she simply said, "Maybe another time." I didn't think much of it at the time, distracted by the search for my map and the shirts. Her words hung in the air, but I couldn't focus on them. She said a few more things, but they slipped past me like shadows. I said goodnight and hurried down her driveway, heading toward my house. Behind me, I could see her walking across the frozen yard, but I didn't turn to wave. I had to get home. I made it home, just before my mom, and by the time she walked in, Josh and I had already changed and warmed up. We'd gotten away with it, though we'd lost the map. It was gone. But then, Mrs. McGee's voice echoed in my mind again. She'd called me Chris, and I shivered. "Just be glad you've never seen her at night," I told Josh, trying to shake off the odd feeling creeping over me. We both laughed, and Josh asked if she'd invited me in for a snack, joking that the snacks must have been so bad she couldn't even give them away. I told him no, and he seemed surprised. It hit me then every time we'd seen her, she'd always invited us in for snacks. But that night, even when I sarcastically invited myself, she'd said no. As Josh continued talking about Mrs. McGee, something else nagged at me. I reached for my shorts and patted the pockets, and there it was. Not the lighter I'd been searching for, but something else, something folded. My stomach dropped as I unfolded the paper. Inside was a large oval, with two stick figures holding hands. One was much bigger than the other, and neither had faces. The paper was torn, part of it missing, but there was a number written in the corner, 15 or 16. I handed the paper to Josh, asking if he'd put it in my pocket. He scoffed, dismissing the idea, but when I pointed to the smaller figure and the initials next to it, Josh's face went pale. It was my initials. I tried to shake it off, but the memory of Mrs. McGee's strange words returned. At the time, I had written off her odd behavior as a result of her sickness, but now, with the paper in my hand, everything felt wrong. Maybe another time, those words echoed in my mind, and I couldn't understand them. Weeks later, men in orange biohazard suits arrived at her house. They carried black bags garbage, I thought at first, but the smell in the air told a different story. The house was condemned, boarded up, and I never saw Mrs. McGee again. But I understand now. She had said that Tom had come home that night. But I now know who really moved in. And I know why I never saw her body, because it wasn't hers that was taken. The bags they carried were filled with something far worse than garbage. I was on my way to the movie, but something about that night felt off. Injecting real horror into the life of a horror fan seemed like an obvious move, and as we walked around the mall, the air grew thick with tension. We talked about the movie, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I told her I thought David Ed was better than Dawn of the Dead, but she refused to agree. I laughed it off, but then I shared the story of when I called her old number, unsure of who would answer the phone. She didn't find it as funny as I did, but still, she took my phone and entered a number. She commented that it might be the worst cell phone she'd ever seen. I told her I couldn't even receive pictures on it. She took it in stride, but when I called her so she'd have my number, she programmed it in. She mentioned that she was graduating, but she hadn't done well in school that year. I told her to attach a picture of herself to the application, and they'd pay her just to look at her. She didn't laugh, and I thought she might have taken offense, but when I glanced at her, she was smiling, blushing, even. As we walked toward the theater, I asked about Josh. She didn't want to talk about him, and when I pressed, she just said, "I don't know." Something about her answer sent a chill down my spine. As we approached the parking lot, I noticed her car was the only one left. The car with the cracked window was gone. She asked if I needed a ride, and though I didn't, I said I'd appreciate it. I drank my whole soda during the movie, and the walking had me feeling pressure on my bladder. I decided I was going to kiss her when she dropped me off, but this biological need was nagging at me. It was my first kiss, and I didn't want anything to rush me. I told her I was going behind the theater to pee, but I'd be back into shakes. She laughed at how funny I found it, but something about her laughter didn't seem quite right. I asked her about Josh again, and she paused for a moment before answering. "Yeah, he's done some bad things." When I went behind the theater, I realized there was a chain link fence running parallel to the wall of the building. It stretched on endlessly, and I thought it would be easier to hop over it and duck out of sight. I climbed the fence and walked just a little ways before stopping to relieve myself. The only sounds were crickets and the faint sound of liquid hitting cement, until a faint screeching noise pierced the air, quickly replaced by the roar of an engine. It was getting closer. As soon as I realized it, I sprinted toward the fence, but before I could get very far, I heard a scream, a brief, piercing sound, and then the deafening crash of an engine. I ran, but tripped on a loose stone and fell, my head striking the corner of a chair. For a moment, everything went blurry, but then, the engine roared again, closer now, and my senses snapped back. I pushed myself up and ran toward the parking lot, terrified that whoever had crashed the car might be near Veronica. But as I reached the parking lot, I saw her car, only, it wasn't parked anymore. Her body lay twisted, crumpled in a way that shouldn't be possible. Bone was cutting through her jeans, and her body was bent at unnatural angles. Her mouth was wide open, her eyes staring at the sky. Blood pooled around her, and I couldn't tell if she was on her back or stomach. The sight made my stomach churn. I tried to call for help, but there was no signal. I reached for her phone, and when I touched it, she gasped for air in a way that sounded like she was trying to inhale the entire world. I staggered back, my heart pounding in my chest. Her body jerked again, cracking and grinding. I knelt beside her, pleading for her to stay still, but her spasms only seemed to get worse. I opened her phone still on and found my number saved on the screen. I called 911, but the guilt of telling her she'd be okay when I knew she wouldn't, it was unbearable. When the sirens arrived, she seemed more alert, but her eyes were wide with the horror of her own condition. Her lips moved, and through the labored breaths, she whispered, "My picture. My picture ... He took it ... I didn't understand. I tried to comfort her, but the words felt hollow. She was slipping in and out of consciousness. When the ambulance came, I rode with her, but she lost consciousness before we reached the hospital. I waited in the room with her parents, who were frantic, and I just sat there, helpless. Days passed. She was covered in thick white casts, her body cocooned in plaster. I visited her every day, but she barely seemed aware of my presence. One day, she whispered through clenched teeth, "Josh ... Josh ran away." I froze. When did this happen? She had been talking about him just days ago. But Veronica's face contorted in pain, and her words trailed off. She cried, and I cried with her, though I think we were crying for different reasons. Weeks passed, and I kept texting her, but she only responded with short, cryptic messages. Then one day, she said she was coming to the midnight movie. I couldn't believe it, but I saved her a seat. She didn't show up. The next day, she texted me, saying, "See you again soon." I was confused, worried, but tried to reassure her. Days passed, and she stopped responding. I couldn't reach her, and I felt this deep sense of dread gnawing at me. Then, my mother told me something that shattered everything. "Veronica is dead. Sweetheart." I couldn't breathe. How could this be? I had just exchanged messages with her. I asked the only question I could: why was her phone still on? My mother's eyes filled with tears, and she couldn't answer. But it didn't matter. Veronica's phone had been on long after her death, sending pictures to my phone, pictures I never received because my phone couldn't handle them. And when her parents finally deactivated the phone, they discovered hundreds of photos sent after she died. I couldn't stop thinking about those pictures. What had been captured? Had I been in any of them? The last message she'd sent me, "See you again soon," echoed in my mind, and I realized with a sickening certainty that whatever had happened, it wasn't over. I hadn't tightened the strap properly, and halfway through the shower, I felt water seeping into the bag, pulling around my fingers. Panic set in. I leapt out, tearing away the latex shield, but the plaster beneath had already begun to soften, its once rigid form now mushy, grotesque from the moisture. The place between my body and the cast, a space that should have been clean, was a festering pit of dead skin. The moisture stirred it, and a rancid odor filled the air, growing stronger with every passing second. It was the smell of decay, of something long forgotten. As I rubbed frantically with the towel, the cast began to crumble, breaking apart in my hands. The stench of rot intensified, and I felt the bile rise in my throat. I had tried so hard that day, tried to be excited, tried to make everything perfect. The first day of school, picking out my clothes with my mom, choosing my backpack and my Ninja Turtles lunchbox. I had imagined myself walking into school, a hero among the other kids. But now, with my cast falling apart, I was the opposite of heroic. I was ashamed, embarrassed, and the idea of having friends felt like a cruel joke. Surely, no one would want to be my friend now. When I showed my mom the damage, it took 30 minutes to dry most of the moisture. She tried to fix it, sliding slivers of soap into the cast, attempting to mask the stench with something more pleasant. It didn't work. The smell still lingered, clinging to me, a reminder of how everything was falling apart. At school, I was pushed into a group for an activity, but I didn't belong. I violated every rule, each mistake making it clearer that I was out of place. I had brought a marker, hoping to collect signatures on my cast, but it felt foolish now. a childish attempt at something I didn't even understand. When I sat alone in the lunchroom, a boy came over and mocked my lunchbox. He said he liked it, but I could tell it was just another way to make fun of me. But then, something strange happened. He had the same lunchbox. It was like a twisted mirror, a reflection of myself, and for the first time that day, I laughed. We began to talk, and I asked him to sign my cast. He asked how I broke it, and I told him I fell from the tallest tree in my neighborhood. He seemed impressed, and I watched as he wrote his name Josh on the cast. Josh and I became fast friends, sharing lunches and secrets. I had never felt closer to anyone. But time passed, and things changed. We drifted apart. We saw each other less and less, until one day, I invited him to my birthday party. He seemed distant, quieter than I remembered. He didn't bring a gift, and when I tried to talk to him, it felt like I was speaking to a stranger. When I asked him what had happened to our friendship, he simply said, "You left." The party continued, and when I opened my gifts, there was one that stood out, a pair of walkie-talkies. I laughed, but when I looked at Josh, I saw something in his eyes. A sickness, a pallor. He excused himself, went into the kitchen, and called his dad. When I asked him who he had called, he said he wasn't feeling well. He left soon after, and as he walked out, he told me something that sent a chill down my spine. "I think I've been sleepwalking." The last time I saw Josh, he was gone, vanished without a trace. His parents searched for him, but the police found nothing. No leads, no clues. It wasn't until weeks later that a connection was made. Josh's disappearance was eerily similar to a case from years before. A woman had called the police, urging them to look into a stalking case. But nothing concrete came from it. Then, a strange series of events unfolded. Josh's father, a man who had once worked construction, began to take odd jobs around the area. One day, while clearing land near my old neighborhood, he stumbled upon something. A box, buried deep in the earth. When he dug it up, he found something that defied all logic. It was a large, brown, blanket-covered box, too long and too wide to be anything ordinary. He knew what it was, but his mind refused to accept it. Despite all evidence to the contrary, he believed his son was still alive. The walls of reality began to crumble for him, just as they had for me. My mother received the call at exactly 6 p.m. She knew who it was before the phone even rang, but the words coming from the other end were distorted, jumbled. All she could make out was, "Down here now. Son, please God." It was enough to make her leave without hesitation. When she arrived, she found Josh's father sitting motionless, his back to the hole, gripping the shovel so tightly that it seemed on the verge of snapping. His eyes, cold and empty like a shark's, stared ahead, unblinking. No matter how she called to him, he wouldn't respond. Only when she reached out to gently take the shovel from him did he slowly turn his eyes toward her. His lips parted, and he muttered, "I don't understand," his voice hollow, like he had forgotten the very concept of words. She could still hear him whispering it as she passed him to look into the hole. The moment her eyes met the sight below, she regretted not gouging them out beforehand. She didn't need to say a word. I could see the despair in her face, the weight of a truth she had carried for nearly a decade, a truth she had hoped she would never have to share. Josh was dead. His face was sunken and twisted, as if the agony of the world had been carved into it. The smell of decay hit her like a physical force. She had to cover her nose and mouth to keep from vomiting. His skin was cracked and leathery, like that of a crocodile, with dried blood streaking his face. His eyes were wide open, staring up at nothing. The look in them horror. Pain was still there, frozen in time, as if he had been waiting for someone to save him, but no one had come. But Josh's body wasn't alone. Someone else was with him, large and face down on top of him. As my mother tried to make sense of the scene, she realized something chilling. The man was holding Josh, their legs tangled together in a way that seemed unnatural, like vines wrapped around each other. As the sun filtered through the trees, it caught something, a glimpse of fabric pinned beneath the weight of the bodies. My mother knelt, pressing her hand to her nose to block out the stench, and pulled the fabric aside. It was a picture of me, as a child. Her heart nearly stopped. She staggered back, gasping, and collided with Josh's father, who still sat motionless, his back to the hole. She understood now why he had called her, but she couldn't bring herself to tell him what she had kept hidden for so long. Josh's family never knew about that night in the woods. She should have told them, but it was too late now. Josh's father, still trembling, stood and moved toward the grave. He was a big man, but the man in the box was larger. He grabbed the collar of the body and pulled, as if he meant to throw it out of the grave in one swift motion. The collar ripped, and the body fell back, landing on top of Josh once more. He heaved the man off, and as he sat the body up right against the wall of the grave, he froze. "Oh God," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Oh God, no." The body was covered in blood, but it wasn't Josh's, it was the man who had been with Josh all this time. The truth was worse than anything my mother had imagined. Josh had bitten the man's neck in a desperate attempt to escape, but the man had died. Josh couldn't move. And when Josh's father had pulled the man's body off, they both heard a sound, a soft, sickening roll of glass against wood. A bottle. My mother took it from him. Ether, the same substance that had been used on Josh. "Oh Josh," Josh's father sobbed, his voice breaking. "What did he do to you?" As my mother stared down at the face of the man who had haunted our lives for over a decade, she realized something horrifying. This wasn't the monster she had imagined. This man wasn't a demon or a fiend. His expression was serene, almost blissful. His lips curled up in a faint, unsettling smile. The wound on his neck, where the skin had been torn away, was not Josh's doing. It was the man's own. But as my mother looked closer, she realized the truth. Josh had bitten the man, but the man had died first. The man had never been human, he had been something else entirely. My mother searched the man's pockets, and she found a piece of paper. It was a drawing of a man holding hands with a small boy. And next to the boy were initials, my initials. I don't know if my mother ever remembered that part correctly, but as she held the paper, I could see the look in her eyes. She knew what had happened. She knew who had been responsible. Josh's father carried his son out of the grave, his hands shaking as he placed Josh on the soft earth. He pressed his hands into Josh's pockets, retrieving a crinkled piece of paper. It was a map, and my heart shattered. It was the map Josh had been working on for my birthday. The map he had drawn, the one he had spent so much time on. My mind raced. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to think that Josh had been taken while working on it. Josh's father, silent and broken, walked away, his back to my mother. He paused by the gasoline canister, his hand resting on it. Then, without a word, he spoke. "You should go," he said. "I'm sorry. It's not your fault. I did this." My mother couldn't bring herself to respond. She stood there, motionless, as he began to pour gasoline over the grave. The fire would cleanse it, burn away the evidence. But nothing would ever erase the truth. As my mother walked away, she looked back one last time. Black smoke billowed into the amber sky. She hoped, with all her heart, that Josh's parents would be okay. I left my mother's house without saying much more. I told her I loved her, but I didn't know what soon meant anymore. I got into my car and drove away. The pieces of my childhood had come together in ways I couldn't have imagined. I thought about Josh, and how much I loved him, how much I still missed him. I thought about Josh's parents, how they had lost everything so quickly, and how they would never know the full truth. I thought about Veronica, the girl I had loved for such a short time. I thought about my mother, who had tried so hard to protect me, and then I thought about the man who had done this to Josh, to me, to all of us. I miss you, Josh. I'm sorry he chose me. but I'll always cherish the memories of you. We were explorers, we were adventurers, we were friends.